The trapper's heart. She knocked, seeking only shelter from the night. He opened the door, expecting no one would stay. But some meetings change everything. Rebecca and Caleb were strangers bound by desperation, until hope taught them to become something more. Not just refugees, not just survivors. Family. The desert wind howled like a dying coyote across the mesa, carrying dust and despair in equal measure. No moon tonight, just stars scattered thin across black sky, offering no comfort to the three figures stumbling through sagebrush and stone. Rebecca Hayes pulled her worn shawl tight around her shoulders, though the threadbare fabric did little against the cold that settled deep in her bones. Beside her, two small shadows moved in silence, heads down, faces hidden behind makeshift masks torn from her petticoat. Emma, 9 years old, kept her spine straight and her complaint swallowed, determined not to show weakness. Little Thomas, barely 6, stumbled more with each passing hour, his tiny hand clutching desperately at his mother's skirt as tears carved clean paths through the dust on his cheeks. Rebecca's feet were raw inside her broken boots. Her lips cracked with each whispered encouragement she offered the children. She didn't know how much farther the trail stretched, wasn't sure if there even was a trail anymore. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't. Not after what Jacob had said before riding off into the night, leaving them stranded at the trading post with nothing but half a canteen and his parting words. "You'll manage, Rebecca. You always find a way." She could still hear his voice in the darkness, could still feel the betrayal when she realized he hadn't just left to scout ahead. He'd left for good, chasing rumors of gold and glory, abandoning his family like yesterday's newspaper. So she walked through the wind, through the pain, through the terrible quiet of the desert night, until she saw it. A light. It glowed steady and warm in the distance, nestled between two towering rock formations. A cabin, smoke rising thin and straight from its stone chimney. Rebecca's knees buckled with relief, but she forced herself upright. "Come on," she whispered hoarsely to the children. "Just a bit more now." They stumbled the last 100 yards together, collapsing against the heavy oak door. Rebecca's knuckles were split and bleeding as she raised her hand and knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time. Her voice cracked as she tried to call out, but only a raw whisper escaped her throat. Then finally, the door creaked open. A man stood silhouetted against firelight, tall and lean, with a fur-lined coat hanging loose across broad shoulders. His face was weathered like old leather, marked with lines carved by wind and solitude. Dark hair hung to his collar, streaked with premature gray. But it was his eyes that stopped Rebecca cold, sharp as winter frost, wary as a trapped animal. For a long moment he said nothing. Neither did she. Words weren't needed when 2 exhausted children clung to their mother's torn dress, shivering despite the desert heat that lingered in the rocks around them. The man's jaw worked once, twice. He stepped aside. "Get in." Rebecca didn't hesitate. She ushered the children inside, practically carrying Thomas across the threshold. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing out the mournful cry of the wind. Warmth hit them like a blessing. The crackle of the hearth, the rich smell of cedar and leather. The man moved efficiently, pulling chairs closer to the fire without being asked. "Sit. Warm yourselves." Rebecca obeyed, unwrapping cloth masks and peeling dust-stiff coats from her children's small bodies. Emma helped Thomas settle into a chair, while Rebecca pulled both of them close, rubbing circulation back into their cold hands. The man disappeared into another room, returning moments later with thick blankets and a tin coffee pot. "Drink," he said, pouring steaming liquid into chipped cups. "Ain't much, but it's hot." Rebecca accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping numb fingers around its warmth as she studied their host. He moved like a man who'd forgotten how to expect company. Everything about him, from the set of his shoulders to the way his boots barely whispered against the wooden floor, spoke of years spent alone. Still, he hadn't turned them away. "Thank you," Rebecca managed, her voice raw from dust and fear. The man grunted. He stirred the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "How far did you come?" he asked finally, breaking the heavy silence. Rebecca hesitated, but something about his steady presence, the way he didn't press or judge, made her answer. 2 days, she whispered. From Widow's Creek trading post, on foot. The man's eyes sharpened slightly. Why? The word hit harder than she expected. Simple. Direct. She swallowed, glancing toward her children, now huddled together and half asleep near the warmth. "Husband left," she said finally. "Had to move on." That seemed enough for him. He didn't pry. Instead, he nodded once and leaned back against the mantel, arms crossed over his chest. "Name's Caleb Stone," he offered after a pause. "Rebecca Hayes," she replied softly. She glanced at the children. "Emma and Thomas." Caleb nodded again. His face remained impassive, but his gaze softened just a fraction as he watched little Thomas's fingers still clutching the edge of his mother's skirt, even in sleep. "You're safe here," Caleb said quietly. "Desert's got teeth at night. You'd not make it another mile in the dark." Relief hit Rebecca so hard she almost wept. But she held it together. She always had. Instead, she met his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Caleb only turned back to the fire, his tall frame backlit by the dancing flames. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song against the cabin walls. But inside, for the first time in what felt like forever, Rebecca and her children were safe. For now. Dawn came slow and pale, the desert holding on to night as long as it could. The wind had finally stilled, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the world holding its breath. Rebecca stirred first, her back aching from sleeping in the chair by the hearth, but her eyes went immediately to the children. Emma and Thomas were still wrapped in borrowed blankets, their faces peaceful for the first time in days. Thomas had shifted in his sleep to curl against his sister's side, and Emma had instinctively curved her arm around him, protective even in dreams. They were safe. For now. Rebecca rose carefully, her legs stiff, and looked around the cabin in daylight. The place was sparse but clean. Traps and pelts lined one wall in neat rows. A shelf of books, worn but carefully arranged, stood near the door. The table bore scars from years of use, but it had been scrubbed smooth. She found Caleb outside behind the cabin. He stood beside a creek that ran clear and swift between red rocks, checking trap lines with practiced efficiency. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and something else. Freedom, maybe. Rebecca stepped carefully down the rocky slope. "You don't have to do all this for us," she said softly. Caleb didn't look up from the trap he was resetting. "Not doing it for you," he replied, his voice matter-of-fact. "Doing it because it needs doing. Creek don't care who's thirsty. Just runs clean for whoever finds it." Rebecca bit back a smile. She recognized the type, men who hid their kindness behind practical words and harder truths. Still, she didn't push. Instead, she knelt by the water's edge and began washing the dust from her hands and face. Caleb paused, watching her. "Could have stayed inside," he said. "I've been sitting too long," Rebecca replied simply. "Feels good to move." He nodded once, a silent approval. Together they worked in comfortable quiet, her gathering smooth stones for the children to play with, him checking the remaining traps. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun had climbed high enough to paint the rocks gold. Inside, the children had begun to stir. Emma sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Thomas clung to his blanket, peeking out cautiously at the tall stranger who moved around the small kitchen area. Caleb poured coffee into 2 cups, black and strong. Rebecca took hers gratefully, warming her hands around the tin. "You planning to move on today?" he asked after a moment. Rebecca hesitated. I thought I would. Had people west or thought I did?" But letters stopped coming months ago. Caleb didn't press. Instead, he simply nodded and sipped his coffee. Deserts full of people thinking West holds all the answers, he said quietly. Most times, you just find more desert. Rebecca met his eyes across the small table. For a moment, something passed between them. An understanding. They were both lost in their own ways, people the world had left behind. As morning became afternoon, the children settled. Emma helped Caleb organize his pelts, her small hands careful and precise as he showed her how to grade them properly. Thomas followed him everywhere, asking endless questions in his piping voice. Why do you live alone? Do rattlers come here? Can I see a real coyote? Caleb, to his credit, answered every single one. Alone's quieter, he said at one point, gesturing to the rifle over the door. Rattlers know to stay clear if you don't bother their dens. Coyotes, you hear 'em most nights. Listen, by evening, something had changed in the cabin. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of Emma's quiet questions about the desert, full of Thomas's laughter as Caleb carved him a small wooden horse, full of Rebecca's humming as she prepared supper from supplies she found carefully stored in Caleb's pantry. You carve beautifully, she said, watching Caleb's hands work the small piece of cedar into something graceful and alive. Caleb glanced up. Keeps the hands busy when the wind won't quit howling. Rebecca watched him a moment longer. I think, she began carefully, you're kinder than you pretend to be. Caleb didn't smile, not exactly. But something eased in his expression, and for Rebecca, that felt like a small victory. Night fell deep and soft. After supper, the children settled near the hearth again, already drowsy from the day's adventures. Rebecca and Caleb sat at the table, the lamp casting warm circles of light between them. Outside, the desert stretched vast and quiet, under a sky thick with stars. Rebecca's fingers curved around her cup as she stared into the flickering shadows. Thank you, she said suddenly, her voice low but certain. Caleb raised an eyebrow. For what? For taking us in. For not asking too many questions. Caleb looked away, his gaze settling on the sleeping children. Didn't seem like you needed more questions, he murmured. Seemed like you needed rest. Rebecca felt something tight loosen in her chest. I did, she whispered. For a moment, silence settled again. Not heavy, not empty, just comfortable. Caleb rose, stretching his lean frame. Morning'll be clear, he said. You can head out if you want. Rebecca nodded slowly, but something about the thought made her stomach clench. Head out. Back into a world that had already broken her once. Or stay. But that was a thought for another night. For now, they were safe. For now, the fire burned steady. And for the first time in a long time, Rebecca Hayes allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, safety didn't have to be temporary. Morning broke clear and bright, the desert painted in shades of gold and red that took Rebecca's breath away. For the first time in days, the horizon held no threat, just endless sky and the promise of heat to come. Caleb Stone stepped onto the wooden porch, boots echoing softly in the still air. He could smell change coming on the wind, not just the shift from cool night to blazing day, but something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Inside, Rebecca and the children were already moving about. Emma was folding blankets with careful precision. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor, playing with the wooden horse Caleb had carved him. Everything felt settled, domestic, right? It felt too right. Caleb knew better than to trust easy. By midday, Rebecca stood in the doorway, shading her eyes as she looked toward the distant trail that disappeared into waves of heat shimmer. Do you think it's safe now? She asked softly. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He set down the trap he'd been mending, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Safe ain't something the desert gives free, he said after a beat. But it's quiet. That's worth something. Rebecca nodded, though worry clouded her face. For a while they worked side by side. Caleb repaired fence around his small garden plot. Rebecca swept out the cabin, humming softly while the children played in the shade of the porch. Something about it felt rooted, permanent. That's when the sound came. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at an unhurried pace, confident and purposeful. Not the desperate gallop of someone fleeing, but the steady approach of men who expected to find exactly what they were looking for. Caleb heard them first, setting down his tools and stepping into the open. His hand didn't move toward his rifle, not yet, but his whole body went still and watchful. 3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer, dark shapes resolving into men as they drew closer. The leader rode a fine bay horse, too expensive for this country. His clothes were dusty but well-made. His hat tilted at an angle that spoke of arrogance rather than practicality. Caleb knew the type instantly. Not an outlaw, not a drifter. Something worse, a man who believed the law existed to serve him. The cabin door creaked behind him. Rebecca stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron out of nervous habit. She saw the riders and went rigid, her face draining of color. "Jacob," she breathed. Caleb didn't need to ask. He knew. The man dismounted with theatrical slowness, pulling off his gloves finger by finger. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that cut like broken glass. "Hello, Rebecca," Jacob Hayes drawled, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Been quite a chase tracking you out here." Rebecca stepped closer to Caleb, placing herself between Jacob and the open doorway where her children waited. "What do you want?" Jacob's smile widened. "What's mine? You, the children. Time to come home and stop this foolishness." "You lost the right to call us yours when you abandoned us," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Jacob tisked, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. "Now, darling, let's not be dramatic. I've had time to think, to reconsider. A man can change, and family belongs together." Caleb stepped forward slightly, his voice quiet, but carrying steel. She said no. Jacob's gaze slid to Caleb, taking in the weathered clothes, the lean build, the hands that bore calluses from years of solitary work. "And you are?" "The man whose roof they're under." Jacob chuckled, low and mean. "How convenient. Wife runs off, finds herself a mountain man to play house with. Real respectable." Caleb's jaw tightened. "You left them to die in the desert." "I didn't." Jacob's charm cracked slightly. "I'm here now, ready to reclaim what belongs to me. And make no mistake, they do belong to me. Law says so." Rebecca's face crumpled slightly at the word law. Caleb saw the fear there, not for herself, but for Emma and Thomas. Jacob saw it too, and pressed. "I'll give you till sunrise tomorrow," he said lightly, as if discussing the weather. "Pack what you can carry. We'll be heading back to civilization where you belong." He mounted his horse again, nodding to his men. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Rebecca. You know how I get when I'm disappointed." The 3 riders turned and headed back toward the trail, leaving churned dust and the echo of threat behind them. That night, the cabin felt like a held breath. The children had heard everything. Emma sat stiffly by the hearth, trying to look brave but failing. Thomas clung to Rebecca, asking in a small voice if they had to go with the bad man. Rebecca paced the small room, wringing her hands raw. "What am I going to do?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "He has the law on his side. He has money. I can't fight that." Caleb sat at the table, staring into the fire's heart. "You don't have to fight alone," he said simply. Rebecca stopped pacing, looking at him with desperate eyes. "What do you mean?" Caleb leaned forward, his voice low and sure. "I've seen men like him before. They think fear and legal papers make them untouchable. But this desert, these people, they know what you are, what you've done for these children." He stood slowly, his lean frame unfolding like a blade. "He's counting on you being afraid, counting on you being alone." Rebecca stared at him, tears threatening to spill. "And if he tries to take them anyway?" Caleb's voice was quiet as winter dawn. "Then he'll have to take them through me." The fire popped loudly, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. For a long moment, Rebecca said nothing. Then slowly, she stepped forward, closer than she'd ever dared before. Her hand came to rest lightly on Caleb's arm. "You would do that? For us?" Caleb looked down at her hand, then back to her eyes. "For family," he said quietly. "I'd do whatever it takes." Rebecca's breath caught. She didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, she nodded once, firm and certain. "Then we stand together." Outside, coyotes began their evening song. But inside, two wounded souls had just drawn a line in the sand. And come morning, Jacob Hayes would learn exactly what that meant. Dawn came like a blade across the desert, sharp and bright and merciless. It should have been just another sunrise, another day of heat and harsh beauty. But for Rebecca Hayes and Caleb Stone, it felt more like the last moment before everything changed forever. Jacob would be back. Men like him didn't make idle threats, especially not when pride and possession were at stake. Inside the cabin, Rebecca dressed the children with extra care. Emma was quiet, her young face set with determination that reminded Caleb achingly of her mother. Thomas asked questions in whispers, too small to understand fully but old enough to sense danger in the air. "You're not going anywhere," Rebecca told them as she braided Emma's hair, forcing calm into her voice. "No matter what that man says." Caleb had been up before dawn, checking his rifle, counting ammunition, doing the cold mathematics of what might come. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't planning to run from one either. By the time the sun climbed high enough to set the rocks blazing, tension filled the air like smoke. And then they heard it. Horses again, but more this time. Jacob had brought reinforcements. 5 riders appeared through the heat waves. Jacob in the lead, still wearing that same cruel smile. Behind him rode a man with a tin star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Coleman, known in these parts for being more interested in who paid his salary than who deserved justice. Caleb stepped onto the porch, Rebecca beside him. This time she didn't hide. Her spine was straight, her chin raised, every inch of her declaring that she belonged exactly where she stood. Jacob dismounted with the same theatrical flair, but his confidence seemed sharper today, more dangerous. "Morning, Rebecca. I trust you've had time to come to your senses." "I have," Rebecca said clearly, "and my senses tell me you have no claim on us anymore." Jacob's smile thinned to a razor's edge. "Sheriff Coleman has papers that say, 'different.'" The sheriff unfolded a document, reading in a bored monotone. "Rebecca Hayes, by order of the Territorial Court, you're commanded to return to the custody of your lawful husband, along with minor children Emma and Thomas Hayes." "That's enough," Caleb interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made even armed men pause. "I know what you are, Hayes. A man who gambles away his children's food money. A man who sees family as property to be owned." Jacob's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You don't have any say in this, Stone. This is between me and my wife." "Not anymore," Caleb replied evenly, "because she's not alone now." As if summoned by his words, voices called out from beyond the rocks. Mrs. Patterson from the trading post, riding in her buckboard. Pastor Williams on his old mule. Doc Henderson, who'd treated half the territory for everything from snakebite to childbirth. They came riding and walking. People who'd seen Rebecca these past months, watched her work to make a life for her children when no one else would. Neighbors in this harsh country where neighbors could be 50 miles apart, but still family when it mattered. "We stand with her," Mrs. Patterson said simply, climbing down from her wagon. "Girl's got more backbone than any 3 men I know." Pastor Williams nodded gravely. "The good book says suffer the little children. That man made those babies suffer. Rebecca saved them. Jacob's confidence began to crack around the edges. "This isn't legal. You can't just—" "Can't what?" Doc Henderson interrupted, his voice carrying decades of authority. "Can't tell a no-account gambling man that he lost his family fair and square when he rode away and left them to die?" Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. The papers in his hand suddenly seemed less important than the wall of determined faces surrounding him. "Hayes," the sheriff said slowly, "maybe we should reconsider." "No!" Jacob snarled, his mask finally slipping completely. "They're mine." "I have rights." "You had responsibilities," Caleb said quietly. "You gave them up when you chose cards over children." The silence that followed was deafening. Jacob's face went through a series of expressions: rage, desperation, and finally the dawning realization that he'd already lost. With a string of curses that made Emma cover Thomas's ears, Jacob wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he shouted over his shoulder. "Yeah," Caleb agreed calmly. "It is." Jacob spurred his horse viciously, disappearing into the desert with his remaining men trailing behind. The sheriff hesitated, then folded the papers and tucked them away. "Seems like there's been some clerical error," he muttered, before riding off in the opposite direction. The gathered neighbors lingered just long enough to offer quiet words of support before drifting back to their own far-flung homes. They didn't celebrate. There was no need. They'd come when called. That was enough. Inside the cabin, the tension finally broke like fever. Rebecca stood by the window, watching the last dust clouds settle on the horizon. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. From relief so overwhelming it threatened to buckle her knees. Caleb came up beside her, close enough that she could feel the solid warmth of him. "He won't be back," she said softly. "Will he?" "Not him," Caleb agreed. "He's a coward when he can't use the law as a club." She turned to look at him then, really look, and something in her chest cracked open, not with pain, but with possibility. She stepped closer, her head coming to rest against his shoulder. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Stand up for us like that." Caleb's hand came up to rest gently on her back. "Yeah," he said simply. "I did. Because you're not strangers anymore." For a moment they stood together in the afternoon light, not as rescuer and rescued, not as refugees thrown together by chance, but as something far more precious and far more fragile: family. Outside, the desert stretched endless and harsh as always. But inside, beside the hearth and surrounded by the soft sounds of children playing, Rebecca and Caleb stood steady against whatever storms might come. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, neither of them felt alone. The days that followed felt different, not because the threat had passed, though Jacob's shadow no longer darkened their doorway, but because something had fundamentally shifted in the small cabin by the creek. The children were still there. Rebecca was still there. And Caleb Stone, who had spent more seasons than he could count alone, with nothing but trap lines and silence for company, was no longer alone. Summer settled over the desert like a comfortable blanket. The heat was fierce during the day, but the cabin stayed cool, built as it was into the shadow of red rock cliffs. Evenings brought relief and the sound of the creek running clear over smooth stones. Inside, laughter returned like rain after drought. Emma helped Caleb with the trap lines now, her small hands quick and sure as she learned to read sign and set snares. Thomas followed him everywhere, a constant stream of questions and observations that should have been annoying but somehow never were. "Why do the rocks turn red when the sun goes down? Can you teach me to carve? Do you think Mama's happy here?" Caleb answered every question with the patience of a man discovering he had patience he'd never known existed. And when Thomas asked that last question, Caleb glanced toward Rebecca, who was hanging laundry on the line strung between two juniper trees, humming softly as she worked. "Why don't you ask her?" Caleb suggested. Thomas ran to his mother, tugging at her skirts. "Mama, Are you happy here? Rebecca paused in her work, clothespins in her mouth, and looked toward Caleb. Their eyes met across the small distance, and she smiled, really smiled. Not the careful expression she'd worn for so long, but something bright and unguarded. Yes, sweetheart, she said, ruffling Thomas's hair. I think I am. That evening, after the children had been tucked into their shared bed and the cabin settled into quiet, Rebecca found herself standing by the window, looking out at stars so thick they seemed close enough to touch. Caleb sat at the table, working by lamplight to repair a bridle, but his attention kept drifting to her. "Penny for your thoughts," he said finally. Rebecca turned from the window, folding her arms across her chest, not defensively, but as if holding something precious close. "I was thinking about before," she said softly, "about how scared I was, how alone." Caleb set down the leather and looked at her fully. "You're not alone now." "No," she agreed. "I'm not." She crossed the room, settling into the chair across from him. "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" "For giving us a home, for making us family." Caleb's hand stilled on the bridle. "You did that yourself. I just provided the roof." Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "You provided everything that matters. Safety, belonging, love." The word hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Caleb looked down at his hands, rough and scarred from years of solitary work. "I never expected," he began, then stopped. "What?" He met her eyes. "I never expected to care this much. About anyone." Rebecca's breath caught. Slowly, carefully, she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I never expected to trust again. To hope again." For a long moment they sat like that, connected by touch and understanding and the kind of love that grew slow and steady, like desert plants putting down deep roots. "Rebecca," Caleb said quietly. "Yes?" "Stay. Not just until the heat breaks, or until you figure out what comes next. Stay because this is home, because we're home." Tears gathered in Rebecca's eyes, but they were good tears, tears of relief and joy, and yes. "I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be," she whispered. Caleb lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then we'll make it official. You, me, the children, a real family." "We already are," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. "We have been since that first night." Later, much later, when the fire had burned down to glowing coals and the desert night wrapped around the cabin like a protective embrace, Thomas stirred from sleep. He padded out to the main room, finding Caleb banking the fire for the night. "Caleb?" the boy asked softly. Caleb turned, surprised. "What is it, son?" Thomas shuffled closer, his nightshirt too big, and his hair sticking up at odd angles. "Are we going to stay here forever?" "With you?" Caleb knelt down to the boy's level, his voice gentle but certain. "If you want to. If that would make you happy." Thomas nodded solemnly. "It would." Can I call you Pa now?" The word hit Caleb like a physical blow, but a good one, the kind that knocked breath from your lungs and filled your chest with light. He pulled the small boy into a fierce hug, holding him close as Thomas's thin arms wrapped around his neck. "Yeah, Thomas," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You can call me Pa." From the doorway, unnoticed by either of them, Rebecca watched with her hand pressed to her heart. Emma stood beside her, slipped from bed by the soft voices, her young face bright with understanding. "We're really staying, aren't we, Mama?" Emma whispered. Rebecca pulled her daughter close, both of them watching as Caleb lifted Thomas and carried him back toward the bedroom, the little boy's sleepy voice already calling him Pa, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Yes, sweetheart," Rebecca said softly. "We're home." Outside, coyotes sang their ancient songs to the star-filled sky. But inside the cabin, beside the glowing coals and surrounded by the steady breathing of chosen family, There was nothing but peace. And love. So much love. It seemed to fill every corner, every shadow, every empty space that had existed before 3 desperate souls knocked on a lonely man's door and changed everything forever. Summer blazed toward its peak, painting the desert in shades of gold and copper. The creek ran lower now, but still clear, still singing its quiet song over sun-warmed stones. In the small cabin nestled between red rocks, life had found its rhythm, but the desert, for all its harsh beauty, still held dangers. And sometimes the past has longer teeth than anyone expects. It started with strange signs, traps disturbed but not sprung. The feeling of being watched when Caleb worked the far trap lines. Horses' hoofprints near the creek, too fresh to be from any of their neighbors' infrequent visits. Caleb mentioned none of this to Rebecca. She was happy now, truly happy, humming as she worked and laughing at Thomas's endless chatter. Emma had begun to smile more, to ask questions about the desert and the animals that lived in it. He wouldn't steal that peace for shadows and suspicions. But on a morning when the heat promised to be brutal even before sunrise, the shadows took shape. Jacob Hayes rode into the clearing alone this time, but there was something different about him, something desperate and dangerous. His clothes were rumpled, his hair unkempt. The arrogant smile was gone, replaced by something harder, hungrier. Caleb was checking snares near the cabin when he heard the horse. He straightened slowly, every instinct screaming danger. Behind him, he heard the cabin door open, heard Rebecca's sharp intake of breath. "I told you this wasn't over," Jacob called out, his voice carrying an edge like broken glass. Caleb turned to face him fully, noting the gun on Jacob's hip, the way his hand rested near it. "Thought you'd learned your lesson." Jacob laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Learned? I learned that you cost me everything. My wife, my children, my standing in decent society. You think that comes without a price?" Rebecca stepped onto the porch, the children close behind her. "Jacob, you need to leave, now." "Leave?" Jacob's voice rose to near hysteria. "I came to reclaim what's mine, what you stole from me." "Nobody stole nothing," Caleb said quietly, his hand moving closer to his own weapon. "You threw it away." Jacob's face twisted with rage. "Maybe I can't have them back," he snarled, "but I can make sure you don't get to keep them either." The gun cleared leather fast, but not fast enough. Caleb was already moving, already drawing, the desert having taught him that hesitation was death. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously, echoing off the red rocks like thunder. Jacob's shot went wide, panicked and poorly aimed. Caleb's didn't. Jacob Hayes crumpled to the dust, his horse shying away from the sudden violence. For a moment the desert went completely silent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Then Rebecca was running toward them, the children close behind. "Caleb! Are you hurt?" Caleb holstered his weapon, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I'm fine." "It's over." He knelt beside Jacob, checking for signs of life he knew he wouldn't find. When he looked up, Rebecca was there, her face pale but resolute. "The children?" "Inside now," she said firmly, and Emma immediately took Thomas by the hand, leading him back to the cabin. Smart girl. She understood without being told. "Was there another way?" Rebecca asked quietly. Caleb looked at her, this woman who had become everything to him, and spoke the truth. "He wasn't going to stop, and I wasn't going to let him hurt you." Rebecca nodded once, then stepped closer and took his hand. "Then you did what you had to do. For family." They buried Jacob Hayes on a hill overlooking the desert, far enough from the cabin that the children wouldn't have to see the grave every day, but close enough that the coyotes wouldn't find him. It was more kindness than he'd shown anyone in life, but Rebecca insisted on it. "Every soul deserves rest," she said simply, as Caleb shoveled the last of the red earth over the makeshift grave. Pastor Williams arrived 3 days later, drawn by word that traveled fast in the sparse desert community. He spoke brief words over the grave, more for Rebekah's peace of mind than for Jacob's soul, then stayed for supper and talked quietly with the children about forgiveness and new beginnings. "Death ain't ever easy," he told Emma, who had asked why her mama seemed sad, even though the bad man couldn't hurt them anymore. "Even when it's necessary. Your mama's got a tender heart. That's nothing to be ashamed of." Life settled back into its rhythm, but deeper now, roots growing stronger in the desert soil. Caleb found himself watching Rebekah differently, not with the careful distance of a man protecting a temporary guest, but with the steady gaze of someone looking at his future. The children bloomed like desert flowers after rain. Emma learned to read the weather signs, to know when flash floods might come racing down the arroyos. Thomas grew taller and browner, his laughter echoing off the red rocks as he chased lizards and collected interesting stones. Both began calling Caleb Pa, as naturally as breathing. One evening in late summer, as the heat finally began its retreat and the first hints of autumn touched the air, Rebekah stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible shades of orange and purple. Caleb came up behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Beautiful night," he said softly. "Every night's beautiful here," Rebekah replied. "I never knew the desert could be so alive." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then, "Rebekah." Something in his tone made her turn to face him. His eyes held a question, vulnerable and hopeful at once. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know you can say no. Nothing changes if you do." Rebekah's heart began to beat faster. "Ask me." Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in soft leather. "I carved this for you," he said, unwrapping a delicate wooden ring, smooth as silk and polished to a warm glow. "Made it from desert ironwood. Tough as anything, but beautiful when you take time to see it right." Rebekah's breath caught. "I know it ain't gold," Caleb continued, "and I know we haven't had much time for courting and such. But I love you, Rebekah Hayes. I love the children like they were my own blood. I want to make this official, proper. Will you marry me?" Rebekah stared at the ring, tears blurring her vision. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, not because of its craftsmanship, though that was exquisite, but because of what it represented. Love, commitment, a future built on choice rather than obligation. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Caleb Stone. I'll marry you." He slipped the wooden ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had always belonged there. Then he pulled her close and kissed her, soft and sure under the desert stars. From inside the cabin came the sound of Emma's delighted squeal. Apparently, they hadn't been as private as they'd thought. Thomas came barreling out onto the porch, followed by his sister. "Are you really going to marry Pa?" Thomas demanded, practically bouncing with excitement. "We are," Rebekah confirmed, kneeling to gather both children into her arms. "How do you feel about that?" "Like we're really truly a family now," Emma said solemnly. "We were already a family," Rebekah told her. "This just makes it official." Pastor Williams performed the ceremony a month later, with half the desert community in attendance. Mrs. Patterson had made Rebekah a simple but elegant dress from fabric ordered special from Santa Fe. Doc Henderson served as Caleb's best man. Emma and Thomas stood as witnesses, their faces shining with pride and joy. The reception was held in the clearing behind the cabin, with lanterns strung between the juniper trees, and a feast that seemed impossible for so remote a location. But desert folks knew how to come together when it mattered, and this mattered plenty. As the evening wore on, and the children fell asleep in chairs dragged out from the cabin, Rebekah found herself dancing with her new husband, under stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. "Mrs. Stone," Caleb murmured against her ear. "I like the sound of that," Rebekah replied. "Think you'll be happy here?" "Really happy, for all the years to come?" Rebekah looked around at their friends and neighbors, at her sleeping children, at the vast desert that no longer seemed harsh but protective, sheltering their small corner of paradise. "I think," she said, "I've never been happier anywhere." Winter came gently that year, bringing cool nights and crisp mornings, but none of the bitter cold that plagued other territories. The cabin stayed warm, heated by love as much as by the stone fireplace. Emma turned 10 that winter, celebrated with a carved wooden doll that Caleb had been secretly working on for months. Thomas learned to write his letters, practicing by lamplight while his parents played quiet games of cards and shared stories of their lives before they found each other. "Tell about when you were little, Mama," Thomas would beg. "Tell about the first animal you ever trapped, Pa," Emma would add. And they would tell their stories, weaving the separate threads of their pasts into the stronger rope of their shared present. Spring returned with wildflower blooms that carpeted the desert in impossible colors. Rebecca planted a garden in the rich soil near the creek, vegetables that would supplement their diet of game and the supplies they bought on monthly trips to the trading post. It was on one such trip that they encountered Sarah Mitchell. She was perhaps 25, traveling alone in a wagon that had seen better years, with a baby strapped to her chest and exhaustion written in every line of her body. Her horse had gone lame, leaving her stranded just outside the settlement with no money for repairs and nowhere to go. Rebecca saw her first, recognized the desperation in the woman's eyes, the particular weariness that came from being alone and vulnerable in an unforgiving world. "Caleb," she said softly, touching his arm. He followed her gaze and understood immediately. Without a word, he changed direction, guiding their wagon toward the stranded woman. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out. "Looks like you could use some help." Sarah's eyes darted between them warily. My horse threw a shoe. I don't have money to pay for repairs." "Who said anything about payment?" Rebecca asked gently. She climbed down from their wagon, approaching slowly so as not to frighten the young woman. "I'm Rebecca Stone. This is my husband Caleb, and our children Emma and Thomas." "Sarah Mitchell," the woman replied hesitantly. "This is baby Grace." The infant in question was perhaps 6 months old, fussing quietly from hunger and heat. Rebecca's heart clenched with recognition and memory. "Where are you headed?" Caleb asked, already unhitching Sarah's lame horse to examine the problem. "West," Sarah said vaguely. "Away from what's behind me." Rebecca and Caleb exchanged a look full of understanding. They knew that story. They'd lived it. "Shoe's cracked clean through," Caleb announced. "Need proper smithing to fix it. But we've got room in our wagon if you'd like to come back with us. Stay until we can get this sorted." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't. I don't want charity." "Not charity," Rebecca said firmly. "Kindness. There's a difference." That night Sarah sat by their fire with baby Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. The first real rest either had gotten in days. The woman's story came out slowly, in pieces. A husband who drank, who hit, who threatened worse when she finally gathered the courage to leave. "I heard there might be work in California," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe family who'd take us in." "Maybe," Caleb agreed. "But desert's got plenty of dangers between here and there." "And traveling alone with a baby?" He shook his head. "Stay," Emma said suddenly. She'd been quietly helping serve dinner, but now she looked up with serious eyes. "Stay like we did. This place is good for people who need to start over." Rebecca felt her heart swell with pride for her daughter's generous spirit. Sarah looked around the warm cabin, at the children playing quietly near the hearth, at the love and contentment that filled every corner. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted. "Then don't go anywhere," Rebecca said simply. "Stay until you figure out what comes next. Or stay forever, if this feels right." And so their family grew again, not through blood, but through choice, through the recognition that some bonds run deeper than mere relation. Sarah moved into the small room Caleb quickly built onto the cabin, and baby Grace became everyone's darling, passed from lap to lap and spoiled by two devoted older siblings. Sarah proved handy with a needle, taking over most of the mending and sewing for the household. She had a gift for growing things too, and under her care, Rebecca's small garden expanded into something that could feed them all through the winter months. Months turned to seasons, seasons to years. The children grew tall and strong and happy. Emma learned to handle a rifle almost as well as her father, and could read animal sign like a book. Thomas became Caleb's shadow on the trap lines, absorbing everything the older man could teach him about surviving in the desert. Sarah found her own kind of peace, her laughter returning gradually as the fear left her eyes. She and Rebecca became sisters in all but blood, sharing the work and the worries and the joys of daily life. Baby Grace learned to walk in the red dust outside their door, her first words a mixture of Mama and Becca and Papa Caleb. She grew into a bright, fearless child who collected insects and climbed rocks with the casual confidence of someone who had never known a world that wasn't safe. The trading post began to look different too. Word spread that the stone place was a refuge for those with nowhere else to go, and occasionally other women would arrive, some staying just long enough to rest and regroup, others putting down roots in the harsh but welcoming desert soil. Mrs. Patterson started calling it Rebecca's Way Station, though Rebecca protested that she wasn't running any kind of formal operation. "Maybe not formal," Mrs. Patterson replied with a knowing smile, "but it's a station all the same. Place where lost souls find their way." One evening, 5 years after Sarah and Grace had first arrived, Caleb sat on the porch watching the sunset and marveling at how full his life had become. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the yard where Emma, now 15 and beautiful, was teaching Thomas and Grace some complicated game involving stones and string. Rebecca emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. At 32, she was even more beautiful than the desperate woman who had stumbled to his door all those years ago. The lines around her eyes spoke of laughter rather than worry now, and her step carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling beside him on the bench he'd built for two, but which now regularly held 3 or 4 or however many needed a place to sit. "Just thinking about how quiet this place used to be," Caleb replied. "Used to think quiet was what I wanted." Rebecca smiled, listening to the cheerful chaos that surrounded them now. "Do you miss it? The solitude?" Caleb considered the question seriously. There were still mornings when he craved the perfect silence of dawn over empty desert. Still moments when the noise of family life felt overwhelming to a man who'd spent so many years alone. But then Thomas would ask him to explain why certain rocks held water, or Emma would show him a bird's nest she'd discovered, or Grace would climb into his lap with a book and demand a story, and he remembered what he'd been missing all those years. "No," he said finally. "Quiet's just empty when you've got nothing to fill it with. This is full. This is right." Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm and home. "I love you, Caleb Stone. Love you too, Rebecca Stone. All of us?" Caleb looked out at their unconventional family. Children by birth and by choice, sisters by circumstance and affection, all held together by the simple decision to care for one another when the world had failed them. "All of you," he confirmed, "every noisy, complicated, wonderful bit." As if summoned by his words, Grace came running toward the porch, her dark curls flying behind her, clutching something in her small fist. "Papa Caleb! Look what I found." She thrust out her hand to reveal a piece of rose quartz, pink and perfect and polished smooth by wind and time. "That's beautiful, little one," Caleb said, lifting her onto his lap. "Where did you find it?" "By the big rock where the water comes out," Grace said importantly. "I think it's magic." "Why's that?" Grace held the stone up to the fading light, watching it catch and hold the pink and gold of sunset. "Because it's pretty even though it came from something hard and scary. Mama Sarah says that's the best kind of magic. Rebecca and Caleb exchanged a look over the child's head, both thinking of how perfectly Grace had just described their own transformation. Beautiful things growing from hard soil, love blooming in the harshest places. "I think Mama Sarah is very wise," Caleb said seriously. Grace nodded solemnly, then wriggled down from his lap and ran back to the others, already launching into an elaborate explanation of her treasure's magical properties. The years continued to turn, bringing changes and challenges, but never shaking the foundation they'd built together. Emma married young Doc Henderson's apprentice when she was 18, but she and her husband built their house just over the ridge, close enough for daily visits and family dinners that stretched long into the evening. Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his stepfather, but with his mother's gentle heart. He took over more and more of the trapping and hunting, but showed no signs of wanting to leave the desert that had shaped him. Grace grew wild and free and fierce, a child of the desert in ways the others couldn't be. She could track a lizard over bare rock and find water where none seemed to exist. The Apache who occasionally traded at the settlement spoke of her with respect, calling her Little Wolf for her keen eyes and quiet ways. Sarah found love again, eventually, with a widower named James, who came through with a supply wagon and decided the view was too fine to leave. Their wedding was held in the same clearing where Caleb and Rebecca had spoken their vows, and Grace insisted on wearing her best dress and carrying flowers even though she proclaimed the whole affair terribly grown up and boring. But perhaps the greatest change came in Caleb himself. The man who had once been content with solitude now found himself the unofficial patriarch of a growing community. Lost souls found their way to his door with increasing frequency, drawn by stories of the stone place where nobody was turned away and everybody found work to do. He built additional cabins, taught young men to trap and hunt, showed women how to read the signs that meant flash floods or sudden storms. Without quite meaning to, he became the heart of a settlement that had no official name, but which everyone called Stone's Haven. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" Pastor Williams asked him one Sunday after services held in the open air, because no building was large enough for the congregation anymore. "What's that?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he knew. "Built yourself a town. These people look to you for guidance, for protection. You're not just a trapper anymore, Caleb. You're a leader." Caleb looked around at the faces surrounding him, some familiar from years of shared meals and celebrations, others new, but already beginning to belong. Children played in the dust while their parents discussed crops and weather, and the thousand small details of community life. "Didn't set out to do that," he said. "Best leaders never do," Pastor Williams replied. "They just do what needs doing, one day at a time, until they look up and realize they've built something worth keeping." That night, Caleb sat on his porch again, but this time he wasn't alone. Rebecca curled against his side, Sarah worked on mending by lamplight nearby, and Grace sprawled across both their laps, fast asleep after a day of epic adventures involving lizards, rocks, and what she swore was definitely a fairy circle near the creek. "Regrets?" Rebecca asked softly, following his gaze across the settlement that had grown up around them. Caleb thought about the question seriously. His life had become nothing like what he'd planned. The solitary trapper's cabin had become the center of a community. His quiet routines were constantly interrupted by visitors, problems, celebrations, crises. He rarely went more than a few hours without someone needing his attention for something. He wouldn't trade any of it. "None," he said finally. "Not a single one." Rebecca smiled, pressing a kiss to his weathered cheek. "Good, because I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. In the lamplight, her eyes held a secret, bright and joyful, and slightly nervous. "What is it?" Rebecca took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Caleb's breath caught. They'd talked about children of their own, wondered if it would happen, hoped it might. But after Grace's arrival had filled their arms and hearts so completely, the question had seemed less urgent. "You're sure?" Very sure. Doc Henderson confirmed it yesterday. Caleb stared at her. This woman who had given him everything he hadn't even known he wanted, who was now offering him yet another impossible gift. Are you happy about it? Over the moon, Rebecca said, laughing at his dazed expression. Are you? In answer, Caleb pulled her close and kissed her thoroughly, not caring that Sarah was trying not to smile at her mending, or that several of their neighbors were probably watching from their own porches. When they finally broke apart, Rebecca was breathless, and Grace was stirring sleepily in protest at being jostled. I love you, Caleb said simply. All of you. Always. Even when there's one more of us to love? Rebecca asked. Especially then. 9 months later, on a perfect spring morning when the desert bloomed with wildflowers and the air smelled of sage and promise, Rebecca gave birth to a son they named Joshua, after the biblical leader who had brought his people safely into the promised land. He was a beautiful baby, strong and healthy, with his father's dark hair and his mother's bright eyes. Emma wept when she first held her new brother. Thomas declared himself the best big brother in the entire territory. Grace announced that she would teach the baby everything important, like which rocks were good for skipping and how to tell if a lizard was friendly. Sarah helped with the birth and the recovery, her gentle hands and calm presence a blessing Rebecca treasured. He's going to be something special, Sarah said, watching the baby sleep peacefully in his father's arms. They're all special, Caleb replied, but his voice held wonder as he studied the tiny face of his biological child. Not more precious than Emma or Thomas or Grace, but precious in a new way, a completion of the circle that had begun with a desperate knock on his door. The settlement continued to grow around them. A proper school was built, with Emma serving as teacher until a real educator could be recruited from back east. A general store opened, run by a couple who'd arrived with nothing but determination and a wagon full of hope. The trading post expanded to include a proper inn for travelers. Stone's Haven, as it was officially incorporated, became known throughout the territory as a place where anyone could find refuge, where hard work was rewarded, and past mistakes weren't held against you. Caleb found himself elected mayor almost by accident, simply because everyone already came to him with their problems anyway. Never thought I'd be a politician, he confided to Rebecca one evening, as they watched their children play in the yard. Joshua, now 3, was trying to keep up with Grace, now 8, and as wild as ever. Emma's oldest daughter, 2-year-old Mary, toddled between them like a small, determined shepherd. You're not a politician, Rebecca replied. You're a father. To all of them, one way or another. She was right, Caleb realized. That's what he'd become, not through any grand design, but through the simple act of opening his door when someone knocked. Father to children born and children chosen, patriarch of a family that now numbered in the dozens and continued to grow. Years flowed like water in the desert creek, sometimes rushing with spring floods of change, sometimes reduced to a quiet trickle of routine, but always flowing, always moving towards something larger. Emma had 4 children eventually, all of them regular fixtures at Sunday dinners that could seat 30 without anyone thinking it unusual. Thomas married a girl from the next settlement over and brought her home to build a house within shouting distance of the original cabin. Grace grew into a young woman of startling beauty and independence, equally comfortable delivering a baby or tracking a mountain cat, though she showed no signs of settling down, despite numerous suitors. Sarah's daughter, baby Grace, who was now anything but a baby, became the settlement's unofficial ambassador to the Apache bands who traded in the area. Her gift for languages and her absolute fearlessness made her invaluable as a translator and mediator. Joshua grew tall and thoughtful, more bookish than his siblings, but no less beloved. He showed early signs of wanting to study law, influenced by watching his father settle disputes and mediate conflicts with fairness and wisdom. Sarah herself remained their rock, the calm center around which the larger family revolved. She never remarried after James died in a riding accident, claiming she was too busy with her own brood and the dozen or so young women who had found their way to Stone's Haven over the years. I'm already mother to half the territory, she would joke. What do I need a husband for? But Caleb sometimes caught her looking wistful when she thought no one was watching, and he made sure to include her in every decision, every celebration, every moment of triumph and crisis that marked their shared life. The desert aged them all, tanned their skin and carved lines around their eyes, but it also refined them, distilling what was essential and burning away what was not. Caleb's hair went completely gray, then white, but his hands remained steady and his eyes remained keen. Rebecca's beauty deepened into something richer than mere youth, the kind of loveliness that came from a life lived fully and well. On his 60th birthday, a celebration that involved 3 days of festivities and visitors from across the territory, Caleb stood on the porch of the cabin that had started it all and marveled at what they'd built. The original simple structure had been expanded multiple times, but the heart of it remained the same. The stone fireplace where Rebecca had first warmed her children, the wooden table where they'd shared countless meals, the windows that looked out over red rocks and endless sky. "Quite a life you've made for yourself," Pastor Williams said, joining him at the porch railing. The pastor was ancient now, his hair white as snow and his back bent with age, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "We've made," Caleb corrected. "None of this happened alone." "True enough, but it started with one man willing to open his door to strangers. That counts for something." Caleb thought about that first night, about Rebecca's desperate knocking and his reluctant welcome, about how close he'd come to turning them away, to choosing the safety of solitude over the risk of caring. "Best decision I ever made," he said quietly. I suspect Rebecca would agree. As if summoned by her name, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her arms full of wildflowers picked by various grandchildren for the celebration. At 55, she was still beautiful, still strong, still the beating heart of their unconventional family. "What are you two conspiring about out here?" she asked, settling the flowers in a vase and coming to stand beside her husband. "Just admiring the view," Pastor Williams said diplomatically. Rebecca followed his gaze across the settlement, taking in the neat houses and gardens, the school where children's laughter echoed across the desert air, the workshops and stores and all the evidence of lives well lived. "It is something, isn't it?" she said softly. "To think it all started with being lost in a storm." "Not lost," Caleb corrected, slipping his arm around her waist. "Finding your way home." The celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing and stories told around a bonfire that cast dancing shadows across the red rocks. Children fell asleep in their parents' arms while adults lingered over coffee and memories. But eventually, the last guests departed for their own homes, and the Stone family, all the various branches and adoptions and marriages that made up their complex tree, settled into the quiet satisfaction of another day well lived. Caleb and Rebecca sat alone on their porch, as they had so many thousands of times before, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "Any regrets?" Rebecca asked, echoing a conversation they'd had many times over the years. Caleb considered his answer carefully, as he always did. His life had been nothing like what he'd planned as a young man. He'd intended solitude and gotten chaos. He'd sought silence and found his days filled with noise and laughter and the constant demands of people who needed him. He'd traded the simple life of a trapper for the complex responsibilities of leadership, the quiet satisfaction of working alone for the messier rewards of building something lasting with others. "Just one," he said finally. Rebecca turned to look at him in surprise. In all their years together, he'd never admitted to any regrets. "What's that?" Caleb smiled, his weathered face crinkling with affection and mischief. "I regret that I was fool enough to think I was happy before I met you." Rebecca laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the desert night. "That's not a regret. That's a blessing. Same thing sometimes." She curled against his side, fitting into the space that had been hers for so many years. It felt like they'd been carved from the same stone. "I love you, Caleb Stone. Love you too, Rebecca Stone. Always have. Always will." Above them, The stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, constant as the desert wind, reliable as the love that had built Stone's Haven from nothing but hope and stubborn determination. Inside the cabin, their son Joshua slept peacefully in the room that had once housed desperate refugees, and now sheltered the next generation of their chosen family. In houses scattered throughout the settlement, children who called them grandmother and grandfather dreamed of tomorrow's adventures. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, harsh and beautiful, and full of possibilities for those brave enough to make it home. And on the porch of a cabin that had started as shelter and become the heart of a community, two people who had found each other against all odds held tight to the love that had made it all possible. Not every family is born. Some are chosen, built stone by stone, heart by heart, day by day. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, that choosing becomes a legacy that lasts for generations. What would you give up to find your true home? What would you risk to protect the family you choose? Share your thoughts below. Your story matters here.